Welcome to Gemara Markings. Today's Shiur is Sucah Daf Yud Aleph. We begin today's Shiur on Daf Yud Aleph in the middle of the Omid. You will notice a new Mishnah. Before we learn the Mishnah, we glance in the book of illustrations, the Pirush Chai, the book that we have been using since the beginning of the Masechta. We're looking at diagram or illustration 169. What we see there, and we can read the caption, which is essentially the words of the Mishnah, Hidlo oleos agefen vesadlas, a plant that is growing, that's branchy. The gefen is a vine, and the dalas and the kisum are also different types of growths, and he took the branches from this growth and spread it across a sukkah. So that's what we see in illustration 169. Now, with that in mind, we look at the Mishnah, Hidlo, Oleo es hagefen, vesadalas, vesakisum, or kisus. These are different types of growths. The gefen we know is a vine, dalas and kisus, other types of growths. Vesikech al gabo, and use the branches of these growths as schach, placing them over a sukkah. Psula. The sukkah is unfit because we have a rule that we do not cover the sukkah with something that is still attached to the ground. V'im hoya sikuch harbe mehen. If, however, in addition to these branches, he had kosher schach that was greater in quantity, so that would outnumber and neutralize the problem presented by this attached schach. Oy shekotzitzon. Or if he detached the branches even after they were placed over the top of the sukkah is kosher. And Rashi points out, and we do not say that since at its initial making it was unfit, so it remains unfit. Not so, but rather true. When you covered the sukkah with the attached branches, at that point the sukkah was unfit. However, by cutting it, you repair the situation. Zeh haklal. The following is the rule. Roman numeral number 1, we broke the Mishnah down into two parts, one positive and then number 2 negative. Kol davar shehu mekabel tuma v'ein gidulo min haaretz ein mesachachin bo. Now there are two separate points over here. Anything that is capable of absorbing tumah. You can have something, for example, a wooden vessel. Now, wood grows from the ground, but it's made into a vessel, and as such, it is makabel tumah. So, if you had a set of wooden bowls, you couldn't use the wooden bowls as schach because it's a dovar shemakabel tumah. Another point, the ein gidulo min haaretz, something that does not grow from the ground. Now, you can have something that, let us say, is metal. Metal does not grow from the ground. And yet, it itself is not fashioned into a vessel. It's just a hunk of metal. That hunk of metal cannot be used as chach, because it falls short in this requirement insofar that it's not gidulo min haaretz. So if the item in question is either one of these, it's mekabel tuma, or it is ein gidulo min haaretz, ein mesachachin bo. You cannot use it for schach. V'chol davar. Now here we have, this is section 2, this is the positive. What is kosher for schach? But you have to note here, we have the two elements that were mentioned under Roman number 1. Here, you have to have their negation, but both have to be in place. The whole davar she'eno mekabel tuma v'gidulo min haaretz, something that is, first of all, it's not a vessel, so it's not mekabel tuma. Plus, it has to be made of a substance that grows from the ground, wood or plant related. It has to have both of these elements, so that we're trying to point out the difference in the Mishnah. Whereas in Roman numeral number 1, the aleph and beis represented or this or that. Here in Roman numeral number 2, both aleph and beis have to be in place in order for it to be kosher as chach. So the Mishnah had said that if it's davar she'eno mekabel tuma and it's v'gidulo min haaretz mesachachin bo, then it can be used as chach. Before we go into the Gemara, we glance at the side where we have a topic heading, and we've noted the phrase Ta'aseh velo min ha'osui. Ta'aseh means something shall be made bekashrus. We have that in parentheses. Ta'aseh bekashrus. Make it in a state of kashrus, that when you're making it, it has to be kosher, and not something that is asui, that was made originally the psul. It was made in a state of being unfit, and then expecting later on for it to become kosher. This, of course, is just a phrase. It's quite abstract at this point. We have to see how to apply that. Hagdoras asiyah. We're going to define what do we mean by asiyah, making something. At what point is something said to be made? Besucah, betzitzis, belulav. In 3 different areas of halacha: making a sukkah, preparing tzitzis, and in the preparation of a lulav. Now, what do you mean in the preparation of a lulav? That's assuming that a lulav needs to be bound together, that the lulav with the other 2 varieties of plant that go along with the lulav. The lulav is we'll call that a palm branch, and the hadassim, myrtle leaves, and the arava, willows, that are taken together, and there is a possibility that they need to be tied or bound together. The Gemara will also feature in the Gemara. You'll see some markings, and we, under our mivneh heading, the structural note, you see a double underline. This features deos beshitas Rav. Bashe'elo ha'im amrinon ksisosen zu hi asiyosen. We're going to see different approaches to Rav regarding the possibility or the practice of ksitzos, and cutting something is considered its making. So now we'll look into the Gemara. Yosef Rav Yosef Kamei de Rav Huna v'Yosef v'Komar. We should note ahead of time that in the next several lines of Gemara there will be pronouns. It's important to keep track of who the speaker is at each point. So here we have Rav Yosef sitting in the presence of Rav Huna, and Rav Yosef is saying, the Mishnah said, Oy shekotzitzon kshera. That's a quote from the Mishnah. Namely, you had the vine branches placed while still attached over the sukkah, and the Mishnah said that if he cut the branches, then the sukkah is kosher. The Omar Rav tzorich linalonea. You've got to move them as well. In other words, cutting them is not enough. You've got to cut them and then shake the branches that originally were placed while still attached. You've got to shake them as well. The shaking of them is tantamount to undoing them and putting them back on. So Rav is according to this quote, granted you don't have to take everything off, but you do have to do this ni'anua. And the reason is because when they were placed on the sukkah in a state of chibur, mechubar, so they were placed in an unkosher state, and the cutting of them is not considered the making of it from the outset. It's not considered a new making. So when the branches were placed on, they were placed on in, as we said in our introduction, ta'aseh v'lo min ha'osui, meaning they were placed in a state of unfitness. The pasuk says, Chag HaSukkos ta'aseh l'cha. So in the pasuk, there's reference made to Sukkos ta'aseh. You have to make a sukkah. And when we say you have to make it, you have to make it, and in the making of it, it has to be made kosher. And that is to the exclusion of preparing something that when you're making it, it's puzzle, and then only afterwards you remove the problem of the psul. That's not enough. Therefore, according to this approach, the branches that were placed on in a state of psul while they were still attached, the cutting off is not the severing of the branches from the original plant is not enough, but you've got to do an act that it's as if you're starting all over again, as if you took off the branches and then placed them back on in a kosher, detached state. And that's accomplished by this process called ni'anua, the shaking of them. The Gemara continues. Omar le Rav Huna. Rav Huna says to Rav Yosef, Ha Shmuel Amra. He says, this idea of shaking them is something that Shmuel says. Ahadrinu Rav Yosef lape. The Omar le Rav Yosef literally he's turned his face around, and it's an expression of displeasure, an expression of anger. He turned around and he said to Rav Huna, Otomiko amino loch delo omro Shmuel. Did I say that Shmuel did not say that? Omro Rav Omro Shmuel. Rav said it like I said, and Shmuel also said it like you claim. Now we have a point, long point. Omar le Rav Huna. Rav Huna says to Rav Yosef, you didn't get the point. When I said that Shmuel made the point of Tzorch Lananea, I was saying something much more definitive. I was saying, Hachi Koamin Allah. Thusly, I was saying to you, the Shmuel Omra Valoi Rav. Only Shmuel would say such a thing of Tzorch Lananea, that in addition to the cutting, you've got to do the shaking as well. Because the Rav himself, Achshure Michshar, Rav would have declared kosher the sukkah covered with these branches by the mere cutting of the branches alone, without the additional shaking. Kiha de Rav Amram Chasida, like is illustrated in the following story. This following story involves Amram Chasida, and Rav will appear in the context of this story. Rav Amram Chasida had a wife, and he prepared tzitzis for his wife's clothing. Now, he was the opinion that women are obligated in the mitzvah of tzitzis. So we're working with that assumption. That itself is a major discussion, but we're working right now with Rav Amram Chasida's point of view that a woman has to have tzitzis in her four-cornered garments. Now, let us take a look at illustration 173 in the Pirush Chai. What do we see there? We see a corner of a garment, so quite magnified, the corner of a garment with, I would like to say with strings put in, but if you look closely at the picture, it's simply one long string that's folded over and refolded till it looks like that. Now, technically speaking, if you want to know how you make tzitzis, you're expected to insert 4 separate strings into a hole, and then they double over, creating an image of 8 strings, but it's really 4 strings that are doubled over. That's the right way of making tzitzis. In the story involving Rav Amram Chasida, he put the tzitzis in like you see there in picture 173. So now, let's continue in the Gemara with one eye on the pictures as well. Kihad Rav Amram Chasida, we're reading in the Gemara, Rama Tchelta. Tchelta means tzitzis. He placed Tchelta, tzitzis, le parzuma, the inshi beise. Parzuma is a name of a garment. Inshi beise means his wife's garment, his wife's parzuma. Tol on, velo, posak, roshe, chutin, shelohem. He inserted the string that was doubled over like you see in the picture, and he made all of the tzitzis knots that you can see in illustration 174. Notice if you look closely at the illustration, it's still essentially one long string, and by using the loose end, one of the loose ends, he was able to create the spiral and the knots as you see. Also lekame de Rav Chia bar Ashi. Rav Amram came to Rav Chia, Omar Le, and Rav Chia told him, Hachi Omar Rav. Rav says, Mafsikon vehein ksherin. All you have to do, because we know that tzitzis have to be 4 strings, and what you have up till this point is basically only 1 string, so all you do is you cut the tips off, as you see illustrated, and by doing that, you're cutting off the 1 long string into several strings. So it's in effect creating the 4 strings doubled over into 8. Cut them off, mafsikon, the hank sharon, and it's okay. Now, when the tzitzis were made, they were made in a state of not being kosher. But by cutting it, that is their making. So it's now kosher. Alma, we see from here, psikos and zuhi asiyosan, the cutting is their making. So that up till this point, I wasn't in violation of ta'aseh v'lo min asui. This is the ta'aseh. This is the making of the tzitzis by cutting off the tips. In other words, everything else you did up till now was preparatory. Now, by cutting off the tips, you are making the tzitzis. Hochanami, so too when it comes to the schach. Tzitzosan, zui asiyosan. As far as Rav is concerned, by cutting the branch from the trunk, detaching it, that's its making, without the need for any further shaking, for any further mianua. At this point, we have a bracketed section. We have also a little star indicating on the side is a note, but Sograyim, within the brackets, Birur Shitas Shmuel. The Gemara will focus on Shmuel's opinion. Achar kach HaGemara Choizeres Lodun B'Shitas Rav. When you turn to Amud Beis, or you scroll ahead to Amud Beis, you notice at the top line a triangled expression, Meisvei, and the triangles will introduce questions on Rav. There's one over here, and there's another triangle a bit later, where the Gemara will be turning to Shitas Rav. The Gemara is, the structure without markings is not the easiest Gemara in the world to follow, because what happens structurally here is the Gemara will be asking on Rav, and then Rav will answer. The Gemara then will interrupt again with a point concerning Shmuel, and then following the next brackets, again you see a triangle, which again is a kasha on Rav. That'll be a long question, 2-part question on Rav. So, with that having been said, let us skip to the first triangle on the top of Amud Beis, Meisvei. Tolon v'lo posak roshe chutin shalahem. He inserted strings into a garment's corner, and he made the knots without cutting the tips. So it says psulim, the tzitzis are unfit. My lab psulim li'olam utiyuf to the Rav. They're unfit, permanently unfit, and that would be a problem for him, because Rav said in a case like this, you can cut the tips and it's kosher. Here it says psulim, permanently unfit. Amar loch Rav answers, my psulin, the word psulin in this source means psulin ad shifsiku. It's possible until you cut off the tips. But once you cut off the tips, your tzitzits are kosher, because that is considered their making. Once again, you see a bracketed section, and just to get a flavor of the Gemara, we'll skip the brackets to the next triangle, Meisvei. Now, the number 1 indicates that, of course, a 2 will follow. There are 2 questions posed. Number 1, Tolon v'achakach posak roshe chutin shalahem psulim. Well, here you see, and we dashed underline, posak roshe chutin shalahem. You are cutting the tips, and psulim, the tzitzis remain unfit. That's a problem for Rav. The Ode, Tanyo Gabi Sucah. And regarding Sucah, we will see another problem posed to Rav. What the Gemara will do, I'll tell you ahead of time, the Gemara will deal with question number 2. It will answer that. However, question number 1 remains a problem for Rav. Now that we have an overview of the Sugya, and we try to maintain the flow focusing on Shitas Rav, we did have a couple bracketed sections. Let's go over them now. The Gemara on Amud Aleph toward the bottom presented Shitas Shmuel, where it was said that which Rav originally had said as Rav Yosef, as Rav Yosef quoted things, Rav Huna said that's Shmuel's opinion, namely you have to cut and shake. That's in the case of the branches of the Sucah. The Gemara now asks, is that really, this is a question here, V'savar Shmuel, the question in the brackets, that's 6 lines from the bottom of Yud Aleph Amud Aleph. This question is in effect on Rav Huna's presentation of Shmuel. Question. And the question takes a few lines to develop. V'savar Shmuel lo amrinam sikasan zuhi asiyasan. Does Shmuel say that the mere cutting is not enough? V'atani Shmuel mishum Rabbi Chia. Here we have Shmuel, and it's noteworthy to emphasize Shmuel's name. He quotes Rabbi Chia as having taught. We have a source with an illustration, 175. So let's together look at illustration 175. What do we see there? We see again a story concerning tzitzis, one long string, folded over, doubled over, as you can see, threaded into 2 holes, 2 corners of a 4-cornered garment simultaneously. So you have one string running through 2 holes, accounting for 2 corners of a 4-cornered garment. So now the source says, Hitil lishnei kronos v'basachas. He put into 2 corners at one time. The achar kach posak roshe chutin shelohen, and then cut the ends. Ksherin. It's kosher. My love, what is this talking about? Shekosher v'haka posek, meaning it was kosher means he tied. He made the knots and then cut. So that we're describing a case that it was naseh b'psul. It was made. The knots were tied. It was made in a state of still being attached, not having separate strings. And then he cut it. And it says here, and Shmuel quotes, it says that's kosher. What do we see? That all you need to do to make something that was prepared in a problematic state, all you need to do is do an act of cutting. The act of cutting, when appropriate, is enough. You don't have to do any more. Lo, that's not the explanation. Shepoisek v'achar kach kosher. For these tzitzis to be kosher, all what needed to be done is that before the knots were made, he cut the strings. In other words, he didn't really start the making process. He had to cut the strings and then start the tying, and then it's considered kosher. The Gemara says, if that's what this source is teaching me, that's quite obvious that it would be kosher. Posek v'achar kach kosher ma'ila meimra, cutting the strings. In other words, after they were threaded, but you cut the strings, making them separate strings. So at this point, things are going well. It's quite kosher, so to speak. And then you tie the strings after the strings are already been separated into separate strings. My lememra. What do I have to tell you that for? What do I need a source to teach me such an point that seems obvious? The Gemara answers, Mahu detema. Without this source, I might have thought, Bo'inon, we're at the top of Omid Beis. Bo'inon kanaf bish'as psil veleka. Kanaf means a corner. That you need to have a separate corner at the time. Psil is the time of insertion of strings. In other words, each corner has a separate set of strings inserted separate set per corner. And that's not happening over here. In illustration 175, it's 2 corners with 1 set of strings. So I might have thought that that's not acceptable. Kamash Malon, the teaching of Shmuel is that is okay. That's okay. That the fact that you threaded the strings into the holes, 2 holes at once, that is not a problem. And by the way, the word kanaf we have in quotation marks because that's a quote from the pasuk. The word kanaf, you can see on the side we have the pasuk quoted from what we know as the Kriya Shema, the 3rd paragraph. It says, and let's read the pasuk together. Daber al bnei Yisrael v'yamato alehem v'yasu lahem tzitzis al kanfei v'gdehem l'dorosam v'nasnu al tzitzis hakanaf psil techeles. So you see the word kanaf in the pasuk, and that one might have thought meant a separate set of strings per corner, and hence Shmuel reveals to us that is not necessary. It's not a binding element. Meisvei, and as we saw before, this was a kasha on Rav. We'll read the Gemara again, but without explanation. The Gemara asks, Tolon v'lo posak roshei chutim shalem psulin. My lav psul le'olam tufte Rav. Permanently puzzle, even, and that's a problem for Rav said that if you would cut them after the strings were tied and made into tzitzis, the cutting is enough. Here you see not so. Omalach Rav answers, my psulim, the term psulim in this source meant psulim ad shifsiku, they're unfit until you do the cutting, but doing the cutting of the tips is enough. That's considered its making. It's asiyah. And we didn't point out, we didn't emphasize enough before, but in the context of tzitzis, the Torah says in the pasuk we just read, v'asu lohem tzitzis. There's a concept of needing to make the tzitzis. You have to make them in a kosher fashion, a kosher way. So according to Rav, the cutting of the tips is considered its making. Now, we just learned Rav's response to the source of the second line from the top of where it said that they're psulin. Rav said they're puzzle until you do the cutting of the tip. Now we read through the brackets. Shmuel Omar psulin li oilam. Shmuel says that the tzitzis will remain puzzle, that cutting the tips is not enough. You'd have to first cut the tips and then make the knots, not having made the knots and then rely on just cutting the tips. V'chein Omar Levi psulin li'olam. Levi agrees with Shmuel. V'chein Omar Rav Matana Omar Shmuel psulin li'olam. Rav Matana quotes Shmuel as saying that. Ika Diamri, another version of names, Omar Rav Matana, another version of Rav Matana's presentation. B'didi have uvda. A matter like this involved myself. It was in me. B'didi means in me, and I had a case like this. And I came present to Shmuel, and Shmuel said, you made the knots while it was still a single string that was folded over. It's puzzle. There's no the tzitzis in this fashion remain puzzle forever. In other words, by simply cutting the tips, that's not going to make it kosher. Meisvei. Now, as we said before, the Gemara focuses on Rav. Rav said that the cutting is enough, and we ask, Tol on, he inserted tzitzis into the corner of a garment, and it was one long string doubled over, and he made the knots. And then he cut the tips. Psulin. What we see here is that after the cutting of the tips, puzzle. That's against Rav. The old Tanya Gabi Sucah, and we have a source concerning Sucah. The pasuk says Ta'aseh, and on the side we've written the pasuk Devarim Perek Tezayin pasuk Yud Gimel. The pasuk says Chag HaSukkos Ta'aseh L'chol Shivas Yomim Bos B'cha Migornecho Mikvecha. So the word Ta'aseh means V'lo Min He'asui. Make the Sukkah in a kosher way, and not use a sukkah that was made initially unkosher. Mikan omru, from here we say, hidlo oleos agefen v'sadlas v'sakisus. If a person spread over the top of his sukkah branches from something that was growing, attached branches, and that's v'sikei chagabon, and use that to cover his sukkah, psula. The sukkah is unfit. Hechidomi, what are the circumstances in this case of the branches, of the vine branches over the sukkah? If he just left them as that is without cutting them, why use the drosha of the word taseh to communicate the disqualification of such a sukkah? Tepok lei, you can learn out on a more basic level, the branches are still attached, so that you don't have to explain the lack of fitness or acceptability because it was made in a state of psul. Right now you have attached branches, and attached branches are unfit as schach. Elo b'shekotzitzon. The case here with the vine branches on the sukkah, and the source says it's unfit. You know what happened there? He put the branches over the top of the sukkah. He cut the branches while they were still covering the sukkah. He cut the branches from the trunk of the vine. V'kotani psula, and the source says it is posel. Ushma mina. From here we see the loy amrinon sisasen zui asiyasen ufyufta derav. We do not say that the cutting is the making, but rather, in this case, it's described as a sukkah that was made with attached branches that were subsequently cut. That's ta'aseh. It was the lo mina osui. This is an example of something that was osui b'psul. It was made b'psul, and the cutting doesn't help. Omar loch Rav. Rav addresses case 2, question 2. Hachabana askinon, the case of the sukkah and the branches that we are darshaning tasam and osui as being, and that the sukkah is unfit. The shalfinu shlufi, the lo minkuro asiyodidhu. Well, you can take advantage of an illustration 176. The person, what happened there is he did cut the branches. However, it was still remained partially attached, so that it wasn't a clear detachment. That's shalfinu shalufi, and you can see that if you look carefully at the trunk of the tree, the branch is being severed, but it remains still attached through its bark. And that's not sufficient because it's not nikr, it's not clear that it was detached. Or as the Gemara says, lo minkra asiyo didhu, it's making, and as far as Rav is concerned, detaching is considered the initial making of it, but it's not visible, it's not clear. So as far as Rav is concerned, question number 2 concerning the vine branches and the sukkah covering, he has an answer for that. Mikol mokoim tol on v'achak posa kashya l'Rav. But the question that came from source number 1, that does present a problem for Rav, because from there we see that the cutting is not its making. It doesn't fulfill the requirements of the making of the tzitzis. Kashya. This is a problem. This remains a problem for Rav. Leimo ketanoi. Shall we say that tzitzos and zuasiyosin is a machloikis tanoim? Before we go further, we have a topic heading on the side, the no saying, which we also indicate hemshech is a continuation. Nisoyon lehami dino shel Rav. There's an attempt here to set up Rav's din, tzitzos and zuasiyosin, that the cutting is considered the initial kosher making of whatever, but kemachloikis tanoim. I want to set that point up as saying this is something Tanoim have a controversy over. Of course, in a situation like that it's a Tanei controversy, at least Rav will have someone to base some Tanaic opinion to base his opinion on. However, we will see that the Gemara will take a turn and end up leaving Rav high and dry, with no one Tanoim wise accepting Rav's analysis. The Gemara we have a structural note in addition, and you can see the diamond that appears. They are shlavim. They represent stages. Lefaresh machlokes Reb Shimon bar Yotzadok v'chachomim be'ovar v'likton li'anvei hadas acharei shekvar negad. The Gemara will introduce a case of a myrtle branch, a hadas branch, and in nature, this hadas branch produces berries. The berries on a hadas branch, if there are too many berries, the hadas branch is rendered unfit. The Gemara later in the Masechta will deal more with the actual arba minim, the 4 different varieties of plants used for the mitzvah of lulav. But in the meantime, just that will suffice for now. The recognition that the preponderance of berries on a myrtle branch renders it unfit. So on page 36 of the Pirush Chai, you can see a myrtle branch, illustration 177. Let us say, as you can see in 178, a myrtle branch with too many berries is attached, is bound together with the other minim, the other plant varieties needed for the mitzvah of lulav. After they were bound together, he then proceeds to pick off the berries. That's the situation we will discuss now. The Gemara, we say lame or ketani. This also, by the way, is a long question. Shall we say that Rav's din is a machlokes tanoim? The source says ovar velikton. We indicated illustration 177, the berries there, and he picked off the berries of a hadas as after they were already bound together, like you see in 178, bound together in the lulav. Posel divrei Rabbi Shimon bar Yotzalak. The lulav is unfit. V'chachomim machshir, and the chum say that's okay. Savruha. Savruha means we make an assumption. Rashi explains that the Rabbanan in the Beis Medrash that wanted to say that the picking off is its making is a machlokas tanoim, so they lay down the following assumption: Savrua de kuli almo lulav tzorech eged. The lulav requires being bound together with the hadassim and aravas. That's what you see in 178. Bialfinon lulav misuka dichtiv gabi suka ta'asev lo min asui. And furthermore, part of our assumption is that we learn lulav from sukkah. Now, in the case of lulav in the Torah, the word ta'aseh or asiyah, making, doesn't appear. However, if we compare these mitzvahs through a method of learning called binyanav, simply comparing topics. This is not a scriptural type elucidation, but it's more of a we'll call topical, logical comparison. Namely, just like the mitzvah of Sucah, which does have asiyah written in its context. Chag HaSukkah is ta'aseh l'cha, asiyah, making something. And we said making means make it in a state of kashrus. Make it, when you make it, it shall be kosher when you are making it. So just like the concept of asiyah applies by Sukkah, it applies to the lulav as well. And the word ta'aseh means when you are making it, it should be made in a state of kashrus. And so what's the making of the lulav? The making of lulav is the binding together of it. Obviously you don't make the plant. The plant grows by virtue of the Almighty who ruled that nature yields plants. So what's your making? Your making is you're tying it together. My lav behol komifliki. So what's the machlokes tanoim that we see here, Reb Shimon, Reb Tzadok, and the Chachamim? It's as follows. The man the machshir, the Chachamim who say that ovar velikton is acceptable, picking off the berries after the plant was already bound together, after the hadas was bound together. He holds Amrinon Gabi Sucah. We would say by the Sucah Ktzitzos Zu Asiyasan, the cutting off of the attached branches is considered the making of the Sucah. The Gabi Lulav Nami Amrinon Likitos Zu Asiyasan, and by the Lulav, the picking off of the berries, the detaching of the berries, would be its making. So that you're making it. This is now its making, and you're fulfilling the requirement of Ta'aseh v'lo min ha'asui. Ve'oman de posio savar. Rabbi Shimon, who says it's unfit. Lo amrinon gabi sukkah ktzitzos zui asiyason. By the sukkah, we wouldn't say that cutting the branch is considered its making, unlike Rav. Ve'gabi lulav nami lo amrinon likitosan zui asiyason. And by the lulav as well, pulling off the berries is not considered its making. So that Rav would at least have the opinion of the Chachamim to base himself on. Umar says, "Lo, this is not the analysis of the Machlokes Tanoim and Ovar Velikton in the berry case. Tekule Alma Loi Amrinon Gabi Sucah Tzitzos Zu Asiyason." All the Tanoim would hold the cutting is not its making. In other words, all the Tanoim would be unlike Rav. Of course, when we say unlike Rav, we mean unlike Rav, who, as explained by Rav Huna earlier. When we say Rav Huna earlier, that throws us back to Yud Aleph Amud Aleph, where Rav Huna presented Rav, as opposed to Rav Yosef's version, where Rav Huna presented Rav as holding that Sisasan Zui Asiyasan. Here the Gemara is saying no Tanoim, namely Rav Shimon, Tzadok, and Chachamim, neither one of them would accept that. The Hacha, here, in the case of the berries, where you have Rav Shimon and the Chachamim arguing, the Melaf Lulav Misukah Komifli. The issue is, do I learn the laws of Lulav from the laws of Sukkah? But let us make it clear. Rav spoke about the Sukkah. What we say henceforth is not going to have bearing directly on the issue of Rav's din. So from at this point on, we're focusing on the issue of the Lulav. But as far as the Sukkah is concerned, no one will agree with Rav. And we say no one, we're talking about Reb Shimon, Reb Tzadok, and the Chachamim. So what's the issue between Reb Shimon and the Chachamim? Do I learn the approach to Lulav from Sukkah? Man de machshir, the Chachamim who say Ovar Velikton is okay. Savar, he holds Lo Yalfinon Lulav Misukah. I don't learn Lulav from Sukkah. In other words, so I won't passel a lulav that was made in a state of psul. And Uman de Posil, Rav Shimon Bar says that the Ovar Velikton is not acceptable. Sari Alfina, lulav misukah. I learn lulav from Sukkah. And just like by Sukkah, the cutting off is not enough, so too the picking off of the berries is not enough. And it doesn't make the lulav kosher. The iboya sema, another approach. Isvirolon the lulav tzarech eged. If you were to assume that the lulav needs to be bound, kule almolo pligi, everyone would agree, the alfinon lulav misukah, that we would learn the laws of lulav from sukkah, and the picking off of the berries would not be of help, would not be its making. The hacha v'hacha miflugi, and here the machlokis with Shimon Tzorach and the Chachamim is more savar tzorach eged, or more savar ain't tzorach eged. Reb Shimon, who says that it's puzzle, is because the lulav needs to be bound together, and therefore it's that's considered the making of the lulav, and it was made with the berries still there, so it was made with psul, and therefore picking off the berries now will be of no help. Or more sovar, the Chacham say ein sorech eged. It doesn't need to be bound together, so there's no issue of making in the first place. Therefore, go ahead and pull off by pulling off the berries, even though you're not supposed to pull off berries, but pulling off the berries will be okay, because there's no issue of making to begin with, because Chomim hold ein tzorech eged, it doesn't need to be bound together. Bepluta, the issue of does a lulav need to be bound or not is a machlokes. Is found in the following machlokes. There's another machlokes tanoim. Again, ubepluta dahani tanoi, and as you see in the following machlokes tanoim, the issue of does a lulav need to be bound together. The Sanya, the source begins with the Tanakama saying, lulav bein ogud bein she'eno ogud kosher. The lulav, whether it's bound or even if it's not bound, even if the branches are separated from one another, the lulav, the hadassim, and the arabas, it's kosher. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, ogud kosher, she'eno ogud pasul. Rabbi Yehuda is more restricted. He says only if it's bound together is it kosher, otherwise it's not. My time under Rabbi Yehuda. Why does Rabbi Yehuda say that the binding together, the tying together of the three varieties is binding? Answer: Yolef lekicha me agudas ezov. There's a gezerah shava, a word comparison between two topics. One is lulav, where the word lekicha appears, and the other is the agudas ezov, the tying together of the ezov with other varieties, as is featured in Sefer Vayikra. And there, the word lekicha appears together with eged, binding, tying together. Siv Hasam, it says there in Sefer Shmos, we have to correct our citation before, but the Agudas Ezov is from Sefer Shmos in the context of the blood applications of the Korban Pesach done in Mitzrayim. And it says, Lekachtem Agudas Ezov, a binding together of Ezov branches. So in this pasuk you see Lekachtem and the word Aguda, something tied together. Uksiv Hacha, by Lulav it says Lekachtem Lochem B'yoyim Harishon. And by Lulav you don't have the word Aguda, but you have the word Lekachtem. And through the word comparison, just like by the Agudas Ezov in Shmos Perek Yud Beis, the word lekachtem appears with aguda, tying together. Understand the pasuk by the lulav where it says lekachtem, it is also to be bound together. Ma lahalon ba'aguda, just like by the ezov it is bound, the branches are tied together. Afkan by also to here by the lulav nami ve'aguda. The Rabbanon who disagree with Rabbi Yehuda, lekicha mi lekicha lo yalfinon, they don't have the oral tradition that dictates the word comparison between these two words lekachtem from Shmos Yud Beis to Vayikra Chav Gimel. So they don't have a tradition, so there's no significance behind the word lekachtem in so far as needing to be tied together. Rashi makes the point that people do not invent these word comparisons on their own. Either you have a tradition or not, and the Chachamim don't have that tradition. Kemanaz lahadesanya. We have a Tanaic source, and we want to figure out who is the author behind it. The source says lulav mitzvah laogdo. The lo ogdo kosher. The lulav, the choice way of fulfilling it is by having the different varieties tied together. But if you did not tie them together, you can still fulfill your mitzvah. Well, who authors that? Rabbi Yehuda. Ki lo ogdo amai kosher. If this were authored by Rabbi Yehuda, well, if you didn't tie it together, why should it be kosher? He said the binding is binding. Rabbanon, amai mitzvah. According to the Rabbanon, they don't require any tying together, so why would the source say that it's a mitzvah to bind them together? The Gemara answers, the Olam Rabbanon he. This source really is authored by the Rabbanon. And you'll ask, so then what's the mitzvah? Umishum she'enamar, because the pasuk says Zeh Keli ve'anvehu. That's a pasuk that's found in the crossing, the song of what we call the Oz Yosher, the song recited upon crossing the sea in the time of Moshe Rabbeinu, and the pasuk is darshaned. The word ve'anvehu is hisnoeh lefonav b'mitzvahs. When performing mitzvahs and making items, articles of mitzvah performance, make them in a proper, in a nice, in a pleasant, pretty way. So when dealing with the lulav, the nicer way to do it is by tying the different branches together, as opposed to having loose branches, so that you fulfill the mitzvah of Zeh Keli Vanveu by tying together the lulav with its other varieties. Zeh Haklal Kol Davar Shemekabel Tuma. The Mishnah told us the rules about what's kosher and what's not kosher for schach. V'chulei, it went on to say V'chol Davar Sheino Mekabel Tuma V'gidulo Min Oretz Nesalim Bo. And that which has both qualities, that it's not Mekabel Tuma and it grows from the ground, it, and only that, is fit to serve as schach. Before we continue in the Gemara, we glance at the side under the Nosei, the topic heading, where we've written Makoros L'schach Kosher, sources for what constitutes schach kosher. Aleph, L'man Domar Ananei HaKovod, and Beis, L'man Domar Sukkos Mamish. There is a machlokes, we'll see this in the Gemara, two opinions as to what is meant by Sukkos in the pasuk that says Ki ba Sukkos Hashafti es b'nei Yisrael. We celebrate the holiday of Sukkot in commemoration of something called the Sukkos. What were the Sukkos? One opinion says it's a reference to the clouds of glory, the Ananei HaKavod that surrounded the nation of Israel during the Exodus period and their sojourn in the wilderness. So in honor of those clouds, we sit in Sukkah booths. Another opinion says that Kiba Sukkos or Shafti is a reference to the actual simple booths that they dwelled in during their journey. So, depending on which opinion you hold is the meaning of Sukkos in the pasuk, we have to find a source that schach has to have these characteristics. Now let's turn to the Gemara. Mino Hanimini. From where do I know that only if it's Eino Makabel Tuma and Gidul Menorah that it's kosher for schach? Omer Reish Lakish Amakro. The pasuk says, pasuk from Bereshis, Perek Beis, which is, we'll call that the time of creation. It says, the Eid Yale Min Haaretz. Eid is a cloud ascending from the ground. Ma Eid Davar Sheino Makabel Tuma. Just like a cloud is something that's not a vessel, it doesn't absorb Tuma. The Gidulo Min Haaretz, and it originates from the ground. Af Sucah, so too Sucah, which means schach. Davar she'ein makabel tuma v'gidulo min haaretz. It also has to have those two characteristics. It is an item, a substance that doesn't absorb tuma, and it grows from the ground. So what's the source of schach? The cloud. Well, using a cloud as your basis for schach conforms to the approach that Sukkos in the pasuk that commands us to celebrate Sukkos in honor of the clouds of glory. So I can use a cloud as featured in the act of creation in Bereshis Beis. I can use clouds as a source for laws of Sukkah, because the Sukkah themselves come to commemorate clouds. But according to the opinion that says that the word Sukkos in the pasuk refers to actual constructed booths. So what is the source? If we skip the brackets momentarily, where the Gemara continues, Ki Osur Rabdi Imam Rabbi Yochanan Makro Chaga Sukkos Tasa Lecha Makish Sukkah Lechagiga, and he goes on there with the sources for that Mad Omar, that it was Besukos Mamash. So by skipping the brackets, you keep the the smooth flow of the Gemara. And in the brackets, the Gemara tells us about these two opinions. So on the side we have a starred note, Sograyim l'shem diluk. The Sograyim, the brackets are for skipping purposes, as we just demonstrated. Kidei lishma al retzef hachashiba, to maintain a continuity of thought. Acharei hashe'ela muva hatshuva. After the question, we then see the answer. The question was, Ma'i kol hameimar. We read in the Gemara, according to Mandomer, that Sukkos mamish. So what's the source for the schach being what we said? And then, skipping the brackets, you get right to the answer. But Socha Sograyim, we continue in our note, within the brackets, Muvo HaMokor Shebo Shnei Hashitos Shenizkiru. You have the source in which the two opinions are cited. So now that the structure hopefully is clear, we go into the bracketed section, Desanya. The Brisa reports, Ki Basukos Hoshafti as Bnei Yisrael. The pasuk that instructs us to celebrate the holiday of Sukkah says, because in Sukkos the Jewish people dwelled. Well, one opinion, Anane Kavod Hoyu. Divrei Rabbi Eliezer says it's a reference to their dwelling in the clouds of glory. Rabbi Kiva Omer Sukkos Mamish Osu Lahem. Rabbi Kiva says the pasuk is describing the physical booths that they made. Honicha, the Rebbe Elazar, Honicha means that it works out well that I have a source for schach being Dover she'eino mekabel tumah v'gidula min ha'oretz from the pasuk of Eid Ya'aleh. Elo Rabbi Akiva Ma'ikol Ameimah. But according to Rabbi Akiva, who says that Sukkos is a reference to actual booths, what is the source for schach being Dover she'eino mekabel tumah v'gidula min ha'oretz? Now the triangles are featured under our Mivneh heading. Gimel Deos Lamala Moker L'Schach She'edover She'enu Mekabel Tuma V'Gidulo Min Ha'oretz Leman Omar She'hoyu Sukkos Mamish. According to that opinion, that they were actual booths, what is the source of the rules of Schach? Three opinions. Number one, Ki also Rav Dimi Om Rav Yochanan Makro. He cites a pasuk that says Chag HaSukkos Ta'aseh L'cha Makish Sukkah L'chagiga. We compare Sukkah, the schach, to a korban chagiga, sacrifice, an animal sacrifice we call a chagiga. Ma chagiga davar she'eno mekabel tuma, the gidulo min ha'oretz, just like a chagiga, which is an animal. An animal does not absorb tuma. A live animal does not absorb tuma. Gidulo min ha'oretz, it derives its sustenance from the ground. It eats in order to survive, grass and what have you, that which grows from the ground. So its sustenance is from the ground. So too, when it comes to sukkah, it has to be something like the animal. It doesn't absorb tumah, and it grows from the ground. We continue at the top of Yud Beis Amud Aleph. I ma chagiga ba'alei chayim av sukkah nami ba'alei chayim. If you're learning from Chagiga, so are you going to tell me just like Chagiga is an animal, so too schach can be accomplished by putting animals on the top of your sukkah? Obviously, no. Ki also Ravin Om Rav Yochanan. Hence, we have another source for schach being Dover She'eno Mekabel Tuma and Gidulo Min Ha'oretz. What does Ravin tell us? Omar Kro Bi Ospecha Migonecho Mikvecha. Now, if you look on the side, Dvorim, Perek, Tezayin, Posuk Yud Gimel, we've included the Posuk for your convenience. It says there, Chag HaSukkos Taseh Chol Shivas Yomim, B'Ospecho Migornecho Mikvech. So in the Posuk that commands us to celebrate Sukkot, it also says these words, B'Ospecho Migornecho Mikvecha. The Gemara Darshans, and again, we can't emphasize enough, this is in the context of Sukkot. Psoiles goren v'yekev hakosuv medaber. Psoiles means the residue, the waste of a goren is a granary, and yekev is a winery. What is the waste of a goren and yekev? Very simply, it's the branches and of the vine branches, and that which remains of a grape cluster after the the grapes have been removed. So what is schach? Schach is made of branches and other growths that are not actual fruit, not the actual fruit, because that's not what the pasuk is talking about. The pasuk is talking about the residue. The Gemara says, who says? V'emo goren atzmo v'yekev atzmo. Maybe what the pasuk is saying is uses schach, the stalks of wheat with the wheat still attached, and the yekev atzmo would mean clusters of grapes with the grapes still on them. And that would be actually a dover hamakabel tuma. Food is something that's makabel tuma. But maybe that's what we're supposed to use as our schach. Omar Rebbe Zera, Yekev ksiv kan, ve'i efsher lesakech bo. The word Yekev is written, and the word Yekev is mashma, implies wine. And you can't cover a sukkah with wine. Therefore, out of default, it has to be a reference to the branches. Maskiflo Rav Yirmiyah. Rav Yirmiyah challenges Rabbi Zera, says, V'emo yayin korosh habo misnir. When the pasuk says yekev, it actually means wine. It's congealed wine. That's this yayin korosh means congealed wine that comes from sneer. Sneer is the name of a place. Shehu doime ligulei velo. It's reminiscent of cakes of pressed figs. Very dense wine, so dense and thick that it actually is a solid, and it can be used as a covering if you were to do so. Omar Rebbe Zera. Rebbe Zera, whose name appears just a few lines above, says, Homil Sahava Biyadon. This matter, namely source for schach, what we thought was in our hands. And also Rav Yirmiyah, V'shalda Beinarga. Rav Yirmiyah came along and threw an axe into it. In other words, as we saw above, Rebbe Zera made the point, Yekev is written in the pasuk, which implies wine, actual wine. And you can't cover with wine. Wine is a liquid; it can't use as a cover. So, what does yekev? What it must mean something other than actual wine. Hence, it means the branches. But then Rabbi Yirmiyah came along and said it could mean actual wine. Rav Ashi Omar Migornecha. Rav Ashi is a continuation of the use of this pasuk. That's why we still are under the heading of the second triangle. But he looks at the pasuk and he says, the pasuk says, "V'osbacha mi garnecha v'lo goren atzmo," means from the goren, not the actual goren. The actual goren are the grains themselves, but that's not what the pasuk is saying to use. Mi yikvecha v'lo yekev atzmo. Now Rashi elaborates. Rav Ashi Omar Shapir. We're reading the Rashi. Shapir mashma psoles mikra. The pasuk itself points to the residue, the waste, namely not the actual food. Tichtiv basvacha migarnacha mashma shata oisvoi v'noitloi min hagoren. But as you're gathering, it says basvacha, you're gathering mi garnacha, to take away from the granary. The goren huwa ochel. The goren itself is the food. That which you take away from there is the residue. So in the case of the grain, it's a reference to the stalks. The stalks, the straw, the hay. That is what you would be using as the schach. And we can describe the stalks without the grain. The stalks are gidulo min haaretz, and they're not mekabel tumah. Rav Chisda Omar Mehocha. Rav Chisda says that my source for the schach standard is learned from the following. Now this pasuk is in Nehemiah, but you have to know the context in which the context of the pasuk is their making of sukkos, and it says there, Tzuhahar v'aviu alei zayis v'alei eitz shemen v'alei hadas v'alei tmorim v'alei eitz avos. Now this pasuk, without translating every point here, it says, go out to the mountains and gather all kinds of leaves, and it says alei hadas, and it says alei eitz avos. So we underlined these two expressions. gather 4 sukkahs, ale hadas and ale eitz avos. Well, hainu hadas, hainu eitz avos. The pasuk in the Torah that says to take your lulav, it says you lekachtem lechem pri eitz hadar, kapois tamorim, anaf eitz avos. And we know that the Anaf Eitz Avos that the Torah is saying to take together with the Arvei Nochal, the Anaf Eitz Avos is the Hadas. So why in this pasuk does it say, in addition to the Ale Eitz Avos at the end, which is the Hadas, it says also take Hadas? So what's this redundancy telling me? Omar Rav Chisda, Hadas Shoite LeSucah, the Eitz Avos lulav. There's a type of myrtle branch, let's call the standard myrtle branch, or the eitz avos. Avos is a type of chain work. But the idea there is that you have 3 leaves growing from the same point or the same level at each interval on the hadas branch. There is something called a hadas shoite. There's an illustration of this 179. If you look carefully, you can see that the leaves are not, you don't have 3 leaves growing at each point. You can have several leaves growing from different points. They're not a chain work of 3 leaves per spot, per level. That's called a hadas shoite. So what the pasuk is saying is that for the mitzvah of lulav, you take the ale eitz avos. You take, and for the purpose of schach of your sukkah, you take the ale hadas. The ale hadas meaning the hadas shoite, which is not acceptable for the lulav, but it is acceptable for the for schach. Well, so there you go. What was used for schach? Something that grows from the ground and is not mekabel tumah. A branch, a hadas branch itself is not a vessel, hence it's not something that is mekabel tumah. It's also not food, so it's not mekabel tumah. Before we conclude, let us remind you that if you wish to be in touch with us, we can be reached at gmarkings@gmail.com. With that, we conclude our Shiur.